There are stories that time seems to forget, stories that slip between the cracks of history, whispered from one generation to the next, but never fully explained. Among them is one that continues to haunt minds and spark debates: the mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children. Imagine it's Christmas Eve, 1945. You're in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The war is finally over. Families are beginning to breathe again, to hope again. And the Sodder family, George and Jenny, and their 10 children are celebrating, just like everyone else. Laughter fills the air. The smell of pine and firewood floats through the house, and the children are excited to open their presents the next morning. But by morning, 5 of those children are gone, vanished without a trace. And from that day on, nothing will ever be the same. This isn't just a story about a fire or a missing persons case. It's a story about resilience, obsession, and unanswered questions that stretch across decades. Why did no remains ever show up in the ashes? Why did so many strange details go uninvestigated? And why did the Sodder parents spend the rest of their lives convinced that their children were still alive? In this journey, we're not just revisiting a cold case, we're re-exploring the emotional and psychological aftermath of a tragedy that defies logic. We're diving into a mystery that challenges the way we think about truth, about closure, and about how far a parent will go for the love of their children. Let's go back to that snowy December night, where everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. The Sodders were a hard-working family. George Sodder, born Giorgio Soddu in Italy, had built a good life in America through grit and determination. He owned a successful trucking business, had a strong reputation in the community, and together with his wife Jenny, they raised 10 children in a house full of noise, life, and the kind of warmth only big families can create. But underneath that picture of domestic peace, there were tensions. George was outspoken about his views, especially against the Mussolini regime, which had earned him more than a few enemies even among fellow Italian immigrants in the area. He had received threats before. Strange visitors came to the house, warning him that his opinions could lead to tragedy. And as the weeks before Christmas rolled in, some things began to feel off. A man appeared at the house offering to install a new fuse box, despite the fact George had just had one put in. Another visitor, a life insurance salesman, grew angry when George turned him down and said ominously, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." Most would brush it off, but looking back, these moments take on a chilling weight. The night of December 24th, 1945, seemed like any other. The older Sodder boys had been working that day. Jenny made a big Christmas Eve dinner. Some of the kids stayed up late, playing with toys and listening to the radio. Around 10 p.m., George and Jenny went to bed, leaving the children who were still awake, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Beatty, in the living room. One of the older daughters had fallen asleep on the couch. Everyone else settled in for the night. Just after midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know. In the background, there was laughter, clinking glasses, maybe a holiday party. Jenny told her she had the wrong number and hung up. Odd, but nothing alarming. She returned to bed but noticed the lights were still on and the curtains weren't drawn. That was unusual. The kids usually took care of that. She turned them off and went back to sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., Jenny was awoken by a loud bang, followed by a rolling noise on the roof. Then silence. Moments later, smoke began to fill the house. The stairway was already engulfed in flames. George and Jenny grabbed their youngest children and ran outside, screaming for the others. But the stairs were on fire. George tried to get to the attic with a ladder, except the ladder that always hung on the side of the house was missing. He tried to start his trucks to drive up to the second floor and climb through a window, but neither truck would start, even though they had worked fine the day before. The family watched in horror as their home burned to the ground, convinced that 5 of their children were trapped inside. But when the ashes cooled and investigators searched the rubble, no bones were found. Not a single one. And that's where the mystery truly begins. Authorities concluded that the children had died in the fire, that their bodies had been cremated in the intense heat. But Jenny didn't believe it. She tested animal bones in similar fires and always found some remains. She collected testimonies. A bus driver reported seeing balls of fire thrown at the house. A neighbor said she saw the children in a car driving away as the house burned. A woman who ran a tourist stop claimed she saw the missing children the following week, accompanied by strangers. George and Jenny put up a billboard with pictures of their missing children and a reward. They never stopped searching. They believed their children had been kidnapped, that the fire had been a cover-up, and that someone perhaps connected to the Italian mafia or enemies George had made was responsible. They received letters and photos, including one of a young man resembling their grown-up son, Louis. It arrived in the mail with no return address and a cryptic note. "I love brother Frankie. Illo boys. A 90132 or 35. Was it real? Was it a cruel hoax? We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that this case has more holes than answers. Why was the phone line cut before the fire started? Why did none of the children cry out from inside the house? Why were there no remains? And why Despite the family's tireless efforts, was the investigation so hastily closed by authorities? The mystery of the Sodder children isn't just about 5 missing kids. It's about a family torn apart, about the ache of not knowing, and about the human need for answers even when the world tells you to move on. It's about fire, yes, but also about the smoldering questions left behind when no one seems willing to find the truth. And so we begin, not with answers, but with a lingering question that refuses to fade. What really happened to the Sodder children? The weeks following the fire were filled with confusion, grief, and a growing sense of unease. In a small town like Fayetteville, rumors traveled fast. Some people sympathized with the Sodders, others quietly questioned their version of events. But one thing was certain, nothing about that night made sense. And as days turned into weeks, George and Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, something big. Investigators ruled the fire accidental, blaming faulty wiring. But George had recently had the wiring inspected and approved. Oddly enough, some of the lights in the house had still been working during the fire. How could that be? If faulty wiring was to blame, the official explanation didn't sit right. And then there's the matter of the missing ladder, the silent trucks, the telephone line that had been physically cut, not damaged by the fire. Each piece was a puzzle, but instead of fitting together, they just added to the mystery. Then came the witnesses. A woman claimed she saw the missing children peering from a passing car during the fire. Another said she had served them breakfast at a rest stop a few days later, accompanied by adults who refused to let the children speak. A third said she had seen them in a hotel room, weeks later, looking confused and frightened. Were these sightings real? Fabricated? Mistaken identity? George and Jenny clung to them as clues. To them, these stories weren't just rumors, they were hope. The family launched their own investigation. They contacted private detectives, wrote letters, followed leads across states. They placed a billboard near the site of their burned house with pictures of their 5 missing children, and the words, "What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or still alive?" They refused to believe their children were gone without proof. And honestly, can anyone blame them? What parent could ever stop searching without answers? As time passed, the case grew colder. Authorities stood by their conclusion. The children had died in the fire. But no one could explain why no remains had ever been found. No one could explain the inconsistencies. No one could stop the questions from multiplying. Why had a witness seen someone throwing balls of fire at the roof just before the blaze? Why did the Sodder family receive a tip years later from a woman in Florida who claimed she had overheard a conversation about the Sodder children being taken to another country? It was like the truth was always just out of reach, slipping through their fingers every time they got close. In 1949, the Sodders persuaded a pathologist to dig up the site of the fire and search for evidence once more. This time, they did find some human vertebrae, but analysis showed that they belonged to someone far older than the missing children. The bones likely had been introduced accidentally during the backfilling process. It was yet another twist in a story that had already defied logic. Once again, nothing added up. The photo came in 1967. It was mailed from Kentucky with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man, about in his 20s, who bore a strong resemblance to Louis, one of the missing boys. On the back, in strange handwriting, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love. Brother Frankie, Hello boys," a 90132 or 35. The family was stunned. They hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky, but he vanished and was never heard from again. Another dead end, another layer of mystery. Over the years, the Sodders received prank calls, false leads, and many letters from people claiming to know something. Most went nowhere, but the hope never died. George built a memorial garden on the site of the old house. The billboard remained for decades. He and Jenny never stopped believing that their children were out there, somewhere, waiting to come home. But hope came at a cost. The Sodders became consumed by the search. Their lives revolved around the case. They distanced themselves from those who didn't believe them. Friends, neighbors, even some of their surviving children struggled under the weight of the unsolved mystery. The family was united by love, but fractured by grief. Each day without answers made the pain deeper, the wound more raw. And all the while, the town moved on. New houses were built. New families came. But the billboard stood as a quiet reminder that some stories refused to be forgotten. The Sodder case wasn't just about 5 missing children anymore. It had become something bigger, a symbol of the unknown, a monument to unanswered questions, and a testament to how far people will go when they refuse to give up. There's a saying that time heals all wounds, but some wounds don't heal. They just become part of who you are. For the Sodders, time didn't bring peace. It brought more questions, more silence, and the same haunting absence. People still debate what happened. Was it a tragic accident, with the children's remains destroyed in the fire? Or was it something more sinister, an organized abduction, a cover-up, maybe even revenge against George for his political views? We'll likely never know. But what makes the Sodder case endure is not just the mystery. It's the humanity behind it. It's about love, desperation, and the relentless pursuit of truth in a world that so often looks away. the story doesn't end here. Not even close. Because when a mystery stays alive this long, it begins to live in the minds of others. And those minds keep asking, keep wondering, what if? What really happened that night? And most importantly, why? As the years turned into decades, the Sodder case transformed from a personal tragedy into a national enigma. By now, George and Jenny were no longer just grieving parents. They were symbols of a mystery that refused to fade. Their story had been featured in newspapers, whispered about in diners and living rooms, dissected in police files and conspiracy circles, and yet, not a single piece of hard evidence ever surfaced to definitively say what happened to the 5 children who disappeared on that cold December night. What makes this case so difficult to walk away from is how ordinary it began. A fire, a small town, but every detail that emerged after the flames were extinguished pointed to something much more complicated. There were too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions, too many eerie moments that, when stitched together, felt like something darker was at play. The ladder, for instance. It wasn't just missing, it was found 75 feet away, down an embankment. Someone had moved it. The phone repairman confirmed that the family's line had been cut, not burned. That meant someone had been outside the house before the fire started. But why? Who would do that? And for what reason? And those truck-reliable machines George used every day both failed to start when he needed them most. A mechanic later suggested they may have been tampered with. Again, a strange coincidence or something deliberate. And then there was the woman who claimed she had seen the missing Sodder children weeks later, with adults who seemed to be controlling them. She remembered their names and descriptions. She said the children looked sad and confused. She seemed credible. But by the time police followed up, the trail was cold. Even more chilling were the rumors of child trafficking. At the time, it wasn't something people talked about openly. But looking back, there were whispers of adoption rings, of children taken from immigrant families who wouldn't be missed or believed. Could the Sodder children have been kidnapped and sold? Could the fire have been staged to hide the crime? It sounds like something out of a novel, but to George and Jenny, it was their reality. They were willing to believe anything, so long as it offered a sliver of hope. It's easy to look at the Sodders and think they were desperate, and they were. But they were also determined. Determined not to let the world forget. Determined to keep pushing, asking, digging. They wrote letters to the FBI. They pleaded for They followed leads across the country, even into Canada and Europe. Every time a tip came in, no matter how thin, they followed it. The FBI declined to take the case, stating it was a local matter. But even J. Edgar Hoover himself wrote to the family, acknowledging the strange nature of the case. Still, without cooperation from local authorities, there wasn't much the Bureau could do, and local law enforcement had already made up their mind. They insisted the children had died in the fire. End of story. But the Sodders wouldn't let it be the end. George began keeping a suitcase packed, always ready to leave at a moment's notice if a new clue surfaced. He carried photos of his missing children with him everywhere. Jenny grew more and more reclusive, often wearing black in mourning for the rest of her life. Their pain was constant, and it changed them. The surviving Sodder children tried to move on with their lives, but how could they? Their childhood was overshadowed by loss and uncertainty. Some of them believed the children were dead. Others sided with their parents, convinced that their siblings were out there somewhere, living different lives, maybe under different names. They never stopped wondering if one day, someone would knock on the door with answers. The billboard became an icon. Drivers passing through Fayetteville would see it and ask questions. Tourists stopped to take photos. Reporters wrote stories. The Sodder mystery became more than a case set, and like all legends, it sparked theories. Some believed the fire was an act of revenge against George for his anti-Mussolini stance, and that the children were taken by someone connected to the Italian government or sympathizers. Others thought it was a kidnapping gone wrong, or that the children had witnessed something they shouldn't have, and were silenced. Some even suggested that the children had been raised in secret, perhaps never knowing who they really were. None of it could be proven, but none of it could be ruled out either. In the end, the lack of closure became the story itself. The fire, the clues, the letters, they all pointed to something bigger, something hidden just beneath the surface. The Sodders became investigators, detectives, mourners, and warriors for truth, all wrapped into one. And as they aged, their desperation never softened, it only deepened. George died in 1969. Jenny followed in 1989. Their children kept the billboard up until the 1990s. Then, slowly, the world moved on. But the questions remained, suspended in the air, like smoke from a fire that never really burned out. What do we do with a story like this? One that refuses to give us answers. One that leaves us with more questions than conclusions. We remember it, because the Sodder children weren't just names on a billboard. They were real kids, with dreams and laughter and lives that might have gone on if not for that night. And the fact that their story remains unsolved is not just a failure of investigation. It's a reminder of how fragile truth can be when no one's looking hard enough. We keep their story alive, not because we think we'll find the answer, but because the search itself matters. Because families deserve closure. Because justice isn't just about courts and verdicts, it's about acknowledgement, about refusing to forget. And maybe, just maybe, keeping the story alive will someday bring the truth to light. In the years after Jenny's passing, the story of the Sodder children faded from headlines but never from the hearts of those who knew it. Even as time moved forward and generations came and went, the questions continued to echo in the minds of anyone who stumbled upon the case. The Sodder billboard, weathered and worn, stood tall for as long as it could, eventually taken down but never forgotten. It had done more than ask a question, it had kept a flame alive, long after the fire had turned to ash. The Sodder siblings who survived the fire tried to live normal lives, though what normal means after a tragedy like that is hard to define. Some married, had children of their own, told stories of their lost brothers and sisters at family gatherings. Others remained quiet, reluctant to relive the pain or revisit the mystery that had defined their childhood. But the search never really ended. It just changed shape, moving from newspaper ads and cross-country road trips to quiet reflection and whispered prayers. In more recent years, the case has found new life online. Amateur detectives, true crime enthusiasts, and internet sleuths have picked it up, digging through archives, comparing theories, and trying to connect dots that law enforcement left untouched. Forums fill with speculation. Podcasts analyze every timeline, every clue. Photos are enhanced. Witness testimonies are re-examined. People care, and that says something powerful. Because at its core, the story of the Sodder children isn't just about what happened. It's about the human drive to know, to understand, to make sense of the senseless. It's about how we deal with grief when closure is stolen. It's about how a family, caught in the worst moment of their lives, refused to give up even when the world told them to let go. And in that, there's something incredibly human, something relatable. We all want answers. We all want to believe that justice matters, that truth matters, that if something terrible happens, someone will care enough to find out why. The Sodders never got that justice. They never found out what really happened that night, but they never stopped trying. That's what makes their story timeless. It forces us to ask questions that go beyond the facts of the case. How many other mysteries are there like this, forgotten by time, overlooked by investigators, dismissed by those in power? How often do families suffer in silence, told their pain is invalid because there's no proof? And how do we, as a society, decide which stories are worth solving and which are left to rot? When we hear about the Sodder case today, it's easy to be drawn into the mystery theories of kidnapping, conspiracies, and the strange clues that still linger. But we can't forget the heart of the story. It's about love, a fierce, unrelenting love, the kind of love that doesn't accept easy answers, that refuses to believe its children simply vanish without a trace. It's a reminder that behind every headline, every unsolved case, there are real people, real families, real pain, and sometimes, keeping their memory alive is the only justice they'll ever get. So maybe we'll never know exactly what happened on that December night in 1945. Maybe the truth is buried, lost in time, or hidden behind doors we'll never open. But as long as we remember, as long as we ask the hard questions, as long as we care, then the Sodder children aren't truly gone. They live on in the minds and hearts of those who hear their story and can't stop thinking about it. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the answer begins. Thank you for taking this journey through one of the most haunting mysteries in modern history. Not just for the sake of curiosity, but for empathy, for compassion, for understanding that sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't the ones solved with evidence, but the ones that leave us asking, feeling, remembering. The Sodder case teaches us that truth can be fragile, that love can be unbreakable, and that even in silence, voices can echo for generations. So keep asking questions, keep digging, keep remembering, because someone, somewhere, still might know the truth. And truth, no matter how long it takes, deserves to be found.